How white women treat black male slaves back then. In this video, we'll look at instances where some of these women showed kindness and compassion towards their slaves, while others acted cruelly and abusively. These women viewed slaves as their property, treating them like objects. To understand this crucial topic, we must first understand the context of slavery in America. Slavery was a terrible system that was deeply rooted in society, especially in the southern states. During this time, enslaved people were treated as property and were not given the same basic rights that every human being deserves. Women, including white women, were active participants in the system. They could inherit slaves from their families or obtain them through marriage, effectively becoming slave owners themselves. Many white women played a significant role in the ownership and management of slaves. As owners, they possessed the authority to control various aspects of enslaved people's lives, including black male slaves. This authority extended to dictating their work assignments and living conditions, and even administering punishment. Enslaved black men were often forced to do difficult physical work like farming, building, and other demanding jobs. White women who were in charge of overseeing the slaves could directly watch over the work being done by black men. However, how they were treated during work depended on the owner's attitude and behavior. The way white women treated their slaves depended on a lot of factors. Some white women were genuinely kind and compassionate. They saw their slaves as human beings who deserved to be treated with respect. They might give their slaves gifts, teach them to read and write, or even help them to escape to freedom. One of the most famous examples of a white woman who was kind to her slaves is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was raised by a mom who was a vocal critic of slavery, so she grew up hearing about all the horrors of slavery, and it had a big impact on her. When she married Calvin Stowe in 1836, they moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. This was a border state, and Cincinnati was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, so Stowe and her husband got involved in the abolitionist movement. Harriet's own slaves were treated well. She taught them to read and write, and she let them attend church services. She even paid them wages, which was unusual for slave owners at the time. Harriet's treatment of her slaves was influenced by her religious beliefs. She believed that all people are created equal, and she felt a moral obligation to treat them with kindness and compassion. Harriet's experiences with slavery informed her writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book's protagonist, Uncle Tom, is a kind and compassionate slave who is willing to sacrifice his own freedom for the sake of others. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a huge success, and it helped to turn the tide of public opinion against slavery. In addition to her own slaves, Harriet also helped to free other slaves. She was a member of the National Anti-Slavery Society, and she spoke out against slavery on numerous occasions. She also wrote several anti-slavery pamphlets and articles. Stowe's treatment of her slaves and her work as an abolitionist made her a role model for other white women who were opposed to slavery. She showed that it was possible for a kind and compassionate slave owner, and she inspired others to fight for the abolition of slavery. However, not all white women were as kind as Harriet. Some were cruel and abusive towards them. They would physically and verbally mistreat their slaves, denying them basic rights and subjecting them to harsh working conditions. The mistreatment wasn't only physical, by the way. Sexual exploitation and abuse were distressing realities for many black male slaves. White women, fueled by their power and privilege, would force themselves upon their enslaved male workers, perpetuating a deeply imbalanced and dehumanizing dynamic. One such example was Marie LaLaurie. She was a New Orleans socialite and serial killer who mistreated her slaves. She was born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787 to a wealthy family in New Orleans. Marie gained infamy when her community discovered that she'd been torturing and even murdering some of the slaves she owned. This shocking revelation caused a scandal, considering she was married and a mother of 2 daughters at the time. In 1834, a fire broke out at her mansion. When firefighters arrived, they found several of her slaves chained in the attic, some of them severely mutilated and emaciated. The public was outraged, and Marie was forced to flee the city. She eventually went into exile in France, where she died in 1849. The extent of Marie's crimes is still debated today. Some historians believe that she was responsible for the deaths of dozens of slaves, while others believe that the number was lower. but there's no doubt that she was a cruel and sadistic woman who inflicted horrific abuse on her slaves. The social status of white women also played a role in how they treated their slaves. White women from wealthy families were more likely to be protected from the harsh realities of slavery, and they were less likely to develop close relationships with their slaves. On the other hand, white women from poor families were more likely to rely on their slaves for their livelihood, and they were more likely to develop close relationships with them. White women who lived in isolated areas were more likely to develop close relationships with their slaves, as they were less likely to be influenced by the prevailing white supremacist ideology. On the other hand, white women who lived in more urban areas were more likely to be influenced by the prevailing white supremacist ideology, and they were more likely to be cruel and abusive to their slaves. So what motivated these women to sexually abuse slaves? One possible explanation is that some of them were motivated by boredom or sexual frustration. However, there could be a deeper reason behind their actions. It is possible that these women sought to compensate for their lack of power in other areas of their lives. Engaging in the sexual exploitation of slaves may have provided them with a sense of pleasure and control in a society where their freedom and influence were limited. Plantation mistresses had a role on the plantations where they were expected to follow traditional Christian values, be virtuous, and keep peace within the home. Their purity and virtue were highly valued, and people often associated them with being sexually pure, restrained, and modest. This idea was used to maintain a racial hierarchy by portraying white women as vulnerable and in need of protection. Additionally, by exerting control over and exploiting enslaved people sexually, these women reinforced both white supremacy and the power of men in society. Enslaved individuals had very limited control over their own sexuality due to the oppressive system they were subjected to. White women, although they also had limited sexual freedom, still had the ability to exploit and control their enslaved people sexually. They would force black men into sexual relationships by threatening to accuse them or taking advantage of their vulnerable position, which reinforced the authority of white men. It's important to remember that these are just generalizations. There were many individual white women who didn't fit neatly into any of these categories. Some were kind to some of their slaves, but cruel and abusive to others, and there were even some who changed their views on slavery over time. Unfortunately, the subject of upper-class white women's sexual relationships and mistreatment of male slaves hasn't been studied much. However, it's important to acknowledge and examine these relationships, considering power imbalances, racial differences, social class, and gender inequalities. Thank you all for watching this video with us, and don't forget to leave a comment down below and let us know what you think about the unfair and degrading situation caused by some white women and the cruel actions they took. See you next time, and bye for now.